Well, I've become increasingly wary and I suppose increasingly bored of talking about COVID, but not for the reasons you might think. It has been over 2 years since COVID was first detected in Australia, and the world, as we know it, was turned upside down. Pandemic plans were thrown out the window as lockdowns, masking, closed borders and quarantine were all introduced. The models, which predicted doom and gloom, were way off, as throughout 2020 and 2021, each new surge, cluster or outbreak was met with draconian restrictions. But the politicians across the world who implemented these decisions have evaded all scrutiny. I take the disease of COVID very seriously and the threat it poses extremely seriously. But right from the get-go, on our Sunday morning show Outsiders, I was questioning the official responses to COVID. As early as mid-April in 2020, I was saying that the lockdowns must end and that May the 1st, May Day, is when they should end. Wow, 2 years ago. I questioned why we weren't paying closer attention to what was happening in states like Florida and in countries like Sweden, Taiwan, and other nations who adopted different COVID strategies to those pursued by our power-hungry premiers, such as, for example, avoiding city or statewide lockdowns. I questioned, as did others, the insanity of the Dan Andrews regime's authoritarian approach, which led to disgusting and shameful scenes, not only in Victoria, which Australians must never be allowed to forget. Scenes that I, for one, will never stop showing you.
Yes, I'm in my pyjamas.
What's
I had
this?
an ultrasound in an hour. Because
Yeah,
I'm
she's pregnant, so...
Police dragged Natalie Benet from her car.
What are you doing? What are you pulling that bag away?
Leave her alone.
What is the children?
Leave her alone.
Okay.
Leave her alone.
I asked many questions, as did some of my more inquisitive colleagues here at Sky, but elsewhere, the mainstream media and the ABC were supine at best, meekly falling into line with the premiers and never asking any hard questions at those interminable, boring press conferences. I also asked questions about the banning of certain alternative treatments, some of them developed right here in Australia, that were being trialled in other countries. I asked, and still ask, about the wisdom of vaccinating young children, who are much less likely to suffer anything more than mild symptoms. I have repeatedly questioned the medical morality and ethics and legality under international treaties of mandatory vaccinations and vaccine passports. So, you ask these questions and you raise these doubts, and what do you get in return? I'll tell you. You get vilified at every turn, and your professional reputation and integrity gets denigrated and smeared right up to being named in the Australian Senate. Them's the breaks, I guess, of being on TV. But here's the thing. 2 years down the track, you also get the rather grim and ironic satisfaction of seeing that on so many fronts your questions and your concerns were valid. You were right in many instances all along. Or were you? To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, when it comes to COVID, there are known knowns and there are known unknowns, and there are plenty of unknown unknowns. Who knows? Which is why we need a royal commission into COVID to finally give us genuine answers about the handling of the pandemic by the political and media classes and by the health bureaucracies. Senator Pauline Hanson has been pushing this idea, and others are now joining her, including the talented and impressive Nationals Senator Matt Canavan, who will join me in a second. People always say that the preparation for royal commissions always costs way too much money, you know, what with all the lawyers and all that stuff, which is true. So, as an act of selfless public service, here I have compiled a list of questions. I've drawn them up for free. Saved the lawyers all the bother. So, here are my questions for any royal commission to take on board. Number 1. Whose decision was it to scrap the previous pandemic plans put into place by the Abbott and other governments? Whose decision was it for the federal government not to join in the Clive Palmer legal challenge to the closing of state borders? Whose decision was it to set up the National Cabinet? Why was the National Cabinet given priority in decision-making over the Federal Cabinet? Under what legislation was the enforced closure of trade and businesses across the nation permitted? Does that legal authority need to be revisited or curtailed to prevent similar outcomes in the event of future pandemics or emergencies? What commercial or financial links, if any, exist between any of our health bureaucrats at a state or federal level and any pharmaceutical companies involved in the production of COVID vaccines? Are there any conflicts of interest between any of our politicians or health bureaucrats and the vaccine industries? Why were certain potential COVID treatments being trialled overseas using medications approved for other uses disallowed by our own health authorities? How many times has this ever occurred in the past? If the answer is it has never happened before, why did it happen this time? How much of the job seeker and job keeper money was pocketed by big business? How much per head did Australian taxpayers spend on stimulus and other such emergency measures? How does this amount compare with other countries? Upon what evidence did our health bureaucrats base their decisions regarding lockdowns and curfews? At what point did our health authorities become aware that the vaccines do not necessarily prevent transmission? Did this discovery alter their advice? How accurate were the predictive models about deaths in Australia due to COVID? What is the federal government's legal definition of mandatory vaccination, or of coercive vaccination, or of manipulative vaccination? These are just some of the questions I would like to see answered. The list goes on and on and on, by the way, and no doubt you've got a few questions of your own you'd probably like answered.